Microworlds, Season 3, Episode 11, History of Queen Victoria. Michelle as Queen Victoria.
She was tiny, obstinate, and famously not amused. She reigned for longer than any other British monarch. She put her stamp on the 19th century. And by the time of her death, Queen Victoria was at the head of the greatest empire the world had ever seen. But this diminutive queen, who came to symbolise all the energy and the enterprise of the Victorian era, was herself a bundle of contradictions. She hated public life, but she loved being the Empress of India. She ruled a large part of the globe, but she did it from her sitting room. Victoria was born in 1819 into a Hanoverian world of elderly gentlemen who ran the country. As a child, she watched her uncles, George IV and William IV, leading somewhat disreputable lives. And when, at the age of 12, she realised she herself would one day be queen, she announced, "I will be good." She was brought up here at Kensington Palace. She was only 6 months old when her father died, so for most of her upbringing, she was with a governess. And it was, by her own admission, a melancholy childhood. All the same, one thing was clear, that although she was a girl who liked to get her own way, Victoria always needed a father figure. That was why, through much of her long life, she came to depend on a string of male advisors, most of them older than herself, to whom she was utterly devoted. One morning in June 1837, Victoria learned that William IV had died. She was still only 18. Just awake, she went downstairs to meet the Lord Chamberlain and the Archbishop of Canterbury, who informed her that she was now Queen of England. Her coronation was a bit of a farce. One of the attendant lords, going to greet the royal coach, fell down a flight of steps. Then the Archbishop tried to force the ring onto the wrong finger, causing Victoria considerable pain. As the ceremony continued in Westminster Abbey, outside 1 million people were cheering. They were delighted with their new queen and the promise of a new age. In many ways, the new age was already emerging. London, Manchester, Birmingham, other major cities had doubled in size since the turn of the century, were developing their infrastructures, such as police forces, and were now connected by a new network of railways. A year after Victoria came to the throne, the first Great Western locomotive chugged out of here, Paddington Station, at the grand old pace of 33 miles an hour. Meanwhile, Victoria was eager to make an impression. Her uncle William had warned her to go slowly, not to make any big promises or hasty replies. But Victoria was renowned for her spirit and determination, and anyone who was going to advise her would clearly need a great deal of tact and diplomacy. Many 18-year-olds would have been intimidated by elderly gentlemen with years of political experience. But Victoria faced her privy councillors with surprising confidence. She spoke in a small but clear voice, and the elderly gents were swept away. "She filled the room," said the Duke of Wellington. Her great adviser was Lord Melbourne, the Whig Prime Minister. He was generous and witty, and they became close. "I like him very much and feel confidence in him," she wrote. "He is a very straightforward, honest, clever and good man." Melbourne was devoted to the young queen, and Victoria valued his advice, but on some subjects she would not budge. One was the bedchamber crisis of 1839, a strange episode involving Victoria's ladies-in-waiting. In May, Melbourne's government had been defeated and he resigned. The Queen was distraught. All my happiness gone, she wrote, in her characteristically melodramatic style. She couldn't face the idea of the cool, intellectual Tory Robert Peel as her Prime Minister. And when Peel demanded that she change her Whig ladies-in-waiting for Tories, she refused. Peel then declined to form a ministry, and a rather shamefaced Melbourne crept back to Downing Street.
Okay.
Victoria, of course, was delighted. She regarded it as a victory for the monarchy. She told Melbourne that he'd have been proud of her composure and great firmness. They wish to treat me like a girl, she wrote, but I will show them that I am Queen of England. A classic example of young Victoria misjudging her power and her importance. Within 2 years, there was a general election. Melbourne was defeated, Peel romped home. The country wanted Peel as Prime Minister, whatever the Queen thought. Her ladies-in-waiting were irrelevant. But Peel never gained much influence over Victoria, because the Queen found herself a husband. Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha was 3 months
Ben
younger than
as
Victoria
Prince
and
Albert.
her first cousin. He was the nephew of her uncle Leopold, who was keen on their match. But Victoria wasn't going to be rushed into marriage. She was wary of being bossed about, and she certainly didn't want lots of babies. Victoria's worries melted away only gradually. When they first met in 1836, she liked Albert's manner, but claimed to find him rather dull. Within 3 years, this had turned into infatuation. And on Albert's arrival in London, the Queen pronounced him beautiful. It wasn't possible for anyone to propose to the Queen of England, so Victoria had to ask Albert. They were married in February 1840, and between then and 1857, despite her reservations, she had 9 babies, 4 sons and 5 daughters.
Skip part 2.
Albert became Victoria's confidant and advisor, and he undoubtedly shaped her thinking. He believed that the monarchy should be strictly neutral in politics, but also that it had an immense moral responsibility to watch and control government. That was potentially tricky. Much of this reflected Albert's need for a position. As head of his family, he regarded himself as the Queen's permanent minister. But that word minister caused problems. Albert hadn't been elected, nor was he accountable to Parliament. Well, eventually a solution was found with the title Prince Consort. This allowed Albert to accompany the Queen at the opening of Parliament, and it also acknowledged his valuable advisory role. Albert was wise, dynamic, and tireless. A terrible man of business, Victoria called him, and she would despair of the way he threw himself into his projects. One of his most ambitious was the Great Exhibition of 1851. Albert was fascinated by the revolution in industry going on all around. He thought that industrialization would lift people out of poverty. The Great Exhibition would celebrate all that was new in industry around the world. When Victoria opened the exhibition on the 1st of May, nothing like it had been seen before. Designed by a gardener, it was like a great glass house enclosing 1 million square feet of floor space. There were over 100,000 exhibits here on display, and in the following few months, 6 million people came to visit. Now that's the same number of visitors attracted by Britain's Millennium Dome in 2000, but then the population was 20 million. This was a project that really seized the Victorian public imagination. Alongside the ideas he developed for the nation, Albert also dreamt up grand schemes for his wife and family. Here on the Isle of Wight, he created Osborne House, a sanctuary that would provide Victoria with lasting pleasure. It would be impossible, she wrote, to imagine a prettier spot. Here we can walk about by ourselves, and we are not mobbed or followed. And that was the key of Osborne. Victoria and Albert wanted their privacy. They bought Osborne in 1845, and Albert immediately set about redesigning it in the fashionable Italian style. Everything about it was designed to impress. But it was also to be a place to relax, to picnic and paint, to enjoy the picturesque gardens and views over the Solent. And there was a private beach for swimming and boating. It was very much a family home, and Victoria and Albert made a point of spending their birthdays here. These sculptures are some of the presents that they gave to each other. On the day itself, a special room would be set aside for these presents. The children would perform a little drama and a band would play. It was all very domestic, or to use Victoria's favourite German word, gemütlich, cosy. And these were the happiest years of her life. But in 1861, tragedy descended. Albert died. It had been a horrible year for Victoria. Her mother's death in March had left her in no state to deal with the news that Albert was seriously ill. He'd contracted typhoid, but the diagnosis was kept from them, so deep was their fear of the disease. Victoria watched Albert decline, and on the 14th of December, she knew the end was near. "Oh yes, this is death," she said. "I have seen it before." Albert died babbling of green fields. He was 42. Nothing in the Queen's life would ever be the same again. Albert's death devastated Victoria. At first, she surprised the royal household by how calmly she took it. But quite soon, it became clear that her grief was going to be long and complicated. "My life as a happy one is ended," she wrote. "The world is gone for me." So Victoria went into the strange and the frozen world of the chronically bereaved. She tried to preserve the image and the idea of Albert in as many ways as she could. Monuments were erected to him all over the country. The Royal Albert Hall was built. Museums were created in his honour using money from the Great Exhibition. The faces of Britain's cities were cast in mourning for the lost Prince Consort. In private, the Queen was nervous and irritable and dogged by bouts of depression. She insisted that Albert's rooms were left as they had been in his lifetime. Every day his clothes were laid out, along with hot water and fresh towels. There were rumours that Victoria was going mad. Her grief lasted for 13 years. She wore the widow's black for the rest of her days. She withdrew from public life, refusing to open Parliament and seeing very little of her ministers. And as time wore on, people began to lose their patience. Some wondered if the Queen had given up. Others, if there were any need for the monarchy at all. There was talk of a republic. The press criticised the Queen's unwillingness to take on official duties. But the truth was that the Queen was beyond caring what the people thought. She was too distraught. She wrote to her Prime Minister, Lord Palmerston, that she could look forward to a pleasureless and dreary life. And yet she wouldn't give up the throne, nor delegate her responsibilities. She was appalled by the idea of her gambling, womanizing son Edward sharing in the sovereign's duties. She held Edward partly responsible for Albert's death, if only because Albert had been so distressed by his son's fast life. Obdurate as ever, here was a queen refusing to attend Parliament or to appear in public, but who wouldn't give up the reins of power. And this time, there was no older man around to advise her differently. Under pressure from the government, she agreed to open Parliament once in 1866, but she found the whole experience so completely exhausting that she refused to do it again. Anything to do with the running of the country she found demanding. She complained that from morning to night her life was work, work, work. But for all her efforts in private, the public saw nothing of her, knew nothing of what she was doing, and Buckingham Palace looked like an empty museum. Joke posters began to appear, advertising it to let.
Skip. Part 3.
Victoria refused to live in London. She much preferred to stay in one of her country places, where she could keep politics at a distance. Here at Osborne, she worked dutifully enough at her desk, reading state papers. But if ministers came all the way from London, she might not even see them, just communicate with them via a private secretary. No wonder that when Gladstone was Prime Minister, he called Osborne the great enemy. On all her estates, she liked the company of her servants, notably a blunt-speaking man named John Brown. Brown was intensely loyal to the Queen. They became close. The government's problem with Brown was that he supported the Queen's reclusive lifestyle. He was protective of her and tended to be over-familiar with visiting ministers, who didn't take to being slapped on the back and occasionally ordered around. It was an arrangement that continually displeased ministers. Benjamin Disraeli, for one, resented having to trek around the country, attending Victoria wherever she happened to be. Visiting the Queen in those days can't have been a lot of fun. She didn't like heated houses, so most guests were left shivering. And then at meal times, she fell ravenously upon her food. And since the rule was that everything was cleared away when the Queen had finished, most guests were left hungry too. Disraeli found Balmoral particularly disagreeable. On his first visit there, he got a stomach upset. On his second, a severe chill. He asked to be excused any further invitations. But Disraeli was the Prime Minister who finally persuaded the Queen to re-enter public life. He had two tricks up his sleeve. One was flattery. When it comes to royalty, he said, you should lay it on with a trowel. And the other was India. Together, his courtly manners and his ambitions for the empire appealed to Victoria, and she happily adopted him as another of her older male advisers. If Albert's death had been the undoing of young Victoria, in her maturity she gained a new lease of life, thanks to India. It was the jewel in her crown. And in 1876, Benjamin Disraeli proposed that she take the title Empress of India. Now that title was reserved for use with regard to India. But Victoria loved being called Empress so much that she used it whenever she felt like it. Although in her entire reign she never actually visited India, Victoria was fascinated by Indian culture and the affection of the Indian people for her. The Queen began to take Indian servants into her royal household. Perhaps the best known of these is this man, Abdul Karim. He taught her Urdu, and he served as her general advisor on Indian matters. And it's curious that for all the pomp and the circumstance surrounding Victoria's reign, she herself was not too fastidious about social rank. She would happily take a nip of whiskey with John Brown. Abdul Karim was the son of a prison pharmacist, but he was made welcome here at Osborne. As soon as Victoria became Empress of India, her life changed for the better. She attended state balls and she went on tours of the country. She won back the public's affection. By the time of the Golden Jubilee in 1887, she'd become the queen they wanted, a semi-magical figure who symbolised the unity of a great empire. When she drove through the streets of London, huge crowds cheered her on. They seemed to have forgotten all their old resentments. Queen Victoria also became Europe's grandmother. Through her eldest daughter, Vicky, she was now related to Kaiser Wilhelm II, who would go to war with Britain in 1914. And her granddaughter, Alex, married Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, who, along with his family, would be murdered by the Bolsheviks in 1918. In one way or another, she was related to the royal houses of Norway, Sweden, Greece, Romania, Spain, and Mexico. All over Osborne House, there are signs of just how important this family network was to Victoria. She herself had a reputation for being rather a stern mother. She saw herself as responsible for the moral development of her children. But that picture seems to say it all. She carried over the model of family life into her role as queen, where she was the matriarch responsible for the welfare of her subjects, in return expecting their love and respect. By the end, she'd got both. Victoria died at Osborne on Tuesday the 22nd of January, 1901. She was 81. As she lay dying, her grandson, Kaiser Wilhelm, knelt at her bedside and held her hand. Her long reign had shown that even a determined queen could not stem the tide of parliamentary progress. But it had also shown that monarchy could be important as a symbol of nation and empire, setting the tone for political, social, and family life. The day she died, she was much revered and much missed. As the novelist Henry James said, "We all feel a bit motherless today."
The end.